Mafia boss discovers his hitman is actually a 12-years-old girl trying to save her brother. Matteo didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, the glowing amber of his bourbon catching the light as he watched the girl's knuckles turn white against the grip of the oversized weapon. The silence in the penthouse was suffocating, broken only by the frantic, shallow breaths escaping her lungs. With a movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed, Matteo reached out. He didn't snatch the gun. He simply placed his large, warm hand over her small, frozen fingers. The contact was enough to break her. The heavy metal slipped from her grasp as if her strength had evaporated the moment she was touched by another human being. A silver .45, Matteo murmured, his voice a low, melodic rumble. A heavy choice for someone who hasn't even grown into their shadow. The heavy oak doors of the office burst open. 3 men, their hands already reaching into the lining of their dark blazers, swarmed the desk. Luca, Matteo's most volatile lieutenant, stared at the girl in disbelief before his face hardened into a mask of professional cruelty. A rat in the walls, Don Caruso, Luca spat, his eyes darting toward the weapon on the desk. We'll take her downstairs. We'll find out who sent her before we handle the mess. The men moved forward, their shadows looming over the girl like vultures. Ilara didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply backed away until her spine hit the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling window, her chin tilted up in a gesture of defiance that looked painfully out of place on a face so young. She looked like a cornered bird, ready to fly into the abyss rather than submit to the cage. "Stand down," Matteo said. It wasn't a shout, but the sheer weight of the command pinned the men to the floor. "Boss, she tried to take your head," Luca protested, his jaw tight. "The rules are clear. Anyone who crosses that threshold with intent doesn't walk back out. We can't look weak." Matteo ignored him. He rose from his chair, a mountain of tailored wool and cold intent, and walked toward the girl. He stopped just inches away, looking down at the dirt under her fingernails and the way her oversized jacket hung off her thin frame. As she trembled, a small, glossy square of paper slipped from her pocket, fluttering to the rug like a falling leaf. Matteo knelt. A gesture that made his men gasp in hushed tones, and picked it up. It was a Polaroid, the edges bent and worn. In the photo, a young boy no older than 6 sat in a dark, concrete room, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored the girl's. Around his neck was a cardboard sign with a single, handwritten date, tomorrow. The Don's eyes darkened, the cold calculation of a mob boss replaced by a simmering, ancient rage. He didn't see a hitman anymore. He saw a sister who had walked into the mouth of a lion because she was more afraid of the hyenas holding her brother. He looked up at Ilara, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Who has the boy, Ilara?" The girl's mask finally shattered. A single, heavy tear carved a path through the grime on her cheek. "The men with the red ink," she choked out. "They said if you didn't die tonight, Toby would." Matteo signaled for his men to leave, a flick of his wrist dismissing the violence lingering in the air. He led Ilara not to a basement or a cell, but to a small, private dining nook bathed in the warm, amber glow of a Tiffany lamp. Within minutes, a silver tray arrived. It wasn't the sophisticated carpaccio or fine wines his guests usually received, but a bowl of steaming pasta al pomodoro and a tall glass of cold milk. "Sit," Matteo commanded gently. Ilara hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting a trap. "In my world, we do not conduct business on an empty stomach. Eat." The girl collapsed into the velvet chair, her small frame nearly swallowed by the upholstery. At first, she picked at the food with trembling fingers, but the scent of basil and garlic overrode her terror. Soon, she was eating with a frantic, animalistic hunger, the kind that spoke of days spent wandering the gray streets of the industrial district on nothing but adrenaline. Matteo watched her from the shadows of the opposite chair, his own hands folded. He wasn't a monster tonight, he was a silent witness to a tragedy he knew all too well. As the clink of the fork slowed, Elara wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve, her eyes finally meeting his. "They call themselves the Vultures," she whispered, her voice still shaky but fueled by the food. "They don't have fancy offices like this. They live in the scrap yards and the basements near the docks." She began to explain that debt. Her father had been a gambler, a man who traded his family's safety for a seat at a table he couldn't afford. When he disappeared, the Vultures didn't come for the money, they knew there wasn't any. They came for the interest. They took her brother, Toby, as collateral, telling Elara there was only one way to wipe the ledger clean. They gave her the silver pistol and a keycard they had stolen from a disgruntled Caruso employee. "They said your life was worth more than all the money in the city," Elara said, her lip trembling again. "They told me if I did it, Toby would be on our doorstep by morning. If I failed, they'd send him back in pieces." Matteo leaned into the light, his face a mask of cold, focused fury. He knew of the Vultures, bottom feeders who lacked the honor of the old families, men who built their empires on the bones of children because they were too cowardly to face real men. They had used a child's love as a weapon, turning a 12-year-old girl into a sacrificial lamb. "The Vultures don't pay their debts, Elara," Matteo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. "They would have killed you both the moment the job was done." He stood up, the shadow of his tall frame stretching across the room like a dark shroud. "But they made a mistake. They sent you to the only man in this city who hates them more than you do." The silence of the dining room seemed to expand as Matteo looked past Elara, his gaze fixing on a point somewhere deep in the past. To the city, Matteo Caruso was a man born of stone and shadow, but as he stood by the window, the reflections of the city lights danced in his eyes like the fires of a memory he had spent decades trying to extinguish. "I wasn't always the man in the tailored suit, Elara," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He saw himself then, not as a don, but as a 10-year-old boy in the slums of Naples, his ribs showing through a thin shirt, his shoes held together by twine and hope. He remembered his younger brother, Nico, a boy with a laugh that could brighten the darkest alleyway. In those days, the neighborhood wasn't run by men of honor, but by the Jackals, a crew much like the Vultures. They didn't care for the codes of the old world, they cared for the currency of fear. Matteo's father had been a hard-working man who refused to pay for protection he didn't need. The Jackals didn't retaliate with a bullet to his father's heart. Instead, they took Nico. Matteo described the 3 days of silence that followed, the way his mother's hair seemed to turn white overnight and the way his father's eyes went hollow. He remembered running through the rain-slicked streets, begging the local bosses for help, only to be laughed at. To them, he was just another street rat with a sad story. When Nico was finally returned, he wasn't the same boy. The light in his eyes had been snuffed out by the cruelty of men who saw children as nothing more than leverage. Nico passed away that winter, his spirit broken long before his heart stopped beating. "That was the day I learned the most important lesson of my life," Matteo said, turning back to Elara. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. "There are monsters who kill because it is their business, and there are monsters who kill because they enjoy the sound of breaking things. I decided then that if I was going to be a monster, I would be the kind that hunts the predators." He had climbed the ladder of the underworld not for the money or the power, but to ensure that his word became the absolute law of the streets, a law that strictly forbade the exploitation of the innocent. In his territory, a child was sacred. To touch one was to sign your own death warrant. He looked at the Polaroid of Toby sitting on the table, then at Elara's tired, hopeful eyes. The ghost of Nico seemed to flicker in the shadows behind her. The Code of Caruso wasn't just a set of rules. It was a blood-stained promise made by a grieving boy 30 years ago. "The Vultures think they are the apex of this city because they are willing to do what others won't," Matteo said, his hand tightening into a fist. "They are about to find out that the only thing more dangerous than a man with everything to lose is a man who remembers exactly what it felt like when he lost it all." Matteo's office transformed into a war room within minutes. The quiet luxury of the penthouse was replaced by the low, frantic hum of a machine being brought to life. He didn't need to shout, a single phone call to his underboss was the spark that set the city's underworld ablaze. From the high-rises to the harbor, the word went out through the architects' network, anyone seen dealing with the vultures was now an enemy of the Caruso family. Luca returned, but the arrogance in his stride had vanished, replaced by a grim efficiency. He laid a digital map across the desk, flickering with blue and red markers. The network is talking, boss. Every street-level informant, every corrupt precinct captain, every dock worker, they're all feeling the heat. They know you're looking, and they're terrified of being caught in the crossfire. As the hours ticked toward midnight, the city felt the shift. It was a tangible pressure, a drop in the atmosphere that warned of a coming storm. Matteo's black sedans began to move through the streets in silent, predatory formations, cutting through the fog like sharks in dark water. They didn't stop at the usual checkpoints, they moved with a purpose that made the local gangs pull their shutters down and lock their doors. "We found them," Luca said, tapping a blinking red icon on the screen. An abandoned meat-packing plant on the edge of the industrial district. It's a fortress of rusted steel and old blood. The vultures have been using it as a hub for their interest collections. Our scouts spotted a man matching the description of the guard in the Polaroid. Matteo stood, the light from the digital map carving deep shadows into his face. He didn't look at his men, he looked at Alara, who was watching the screen with her heart in her throat. She saw the V symbol on the map, the nest where they were keeping her brother. "They think they're invisible because they hide in the rot," Matteo said, his voice cold and terrifyingly calm. "They think because they operate in the cracks of the city, the law of the streets doesn't apply to them." He reached into his desk and pulled out a heavy, black tactical vest, sliding it over his tailored shirt. It was a jarring contrast, the refined Don preparing for a gutter war. He checked his watch. The tomorrow date on the sign around Toby's neck was only hours away. The city trembled because it knew that when Matteo Caruso moved with this kind of intent, he didn't just intend to arrest or negotiate. He intended to erase. "Luca, prep the strike team. No sirens. No warnings," Matteo commanded as he headed for the private elevator. "Tonight, we're not just rescuing a boy. We're burning the nest." As the elevator doors began to slide shut, a small, dirt-streaked hand caught the sensor. Alara stood there, her chest heaving, her oversized jacket swimming around her frame. Behind her, the remnants of the pasta dinner sat cold on the table, a stark reminder of the childhood she was currently discarding. "I'm coming with you," she stated. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum delivered with the kind of iron-willed stare that Matteo usually only saw in men 3 times her age. Luca stepped forward, his face twisting in annoyance. "Boss, we're going into a live fire zone. This isn't a field trip. The girl stays here under guard." Matteo looked down at her. He expected to see a child seeking revenge, or perhaps a girl paralyzed by the violence she had nearly committed earlier that night. Instead, he saw a strategist. Her eyes weren't on him, they were on the tactical map glowing in the background. "You won't get through the front," Alara said, ignoring Luca entirely. "The vultures, they have cameras in the old smoking chimneys. They'll see your cars coming from 3 blocks away. Before you even touch the door, they'll move Toby to the tunnels, and then you'll never find him." Matteo signaled for Luca to wait. He knelt again, bringing himself to her level. "And what do you know that my scouts don't, Alara?" "The drainage pipes," she whispered, her hands moving as if tracing a path in the air. "There's a spillway that runs under the packing plant. It's clogged with trash and old iron, so they don't think anything bigger than a rat can get through. But I've been there. I used to hide there when the collectors came to our apartment. I know the exact grate that leads into the basement, right under the room where they keep the interest." The room went still. Luca checked his tablet, pulling up the 1950s architectural blueprints of the industrial district. Boss, she's right. There's an old municipal runoff line that isn't on the modern grid. If it's open, we could put a four-man team inside the belly of the building without making a sound. Matteo studied her. He saw the trembling in her knees, but he also saw the way she gripped the strap of her bag to steady herself. She was terrified, but she was choosing her brother over her fear. It was a brand of courage that no Mafia initiation could ever teach. You stay in the armored car until the floor is clear, Matteo said, his voice a final, unyielding decree. But you lead us to the pipe. He stood up and held out his hand, not to lead her like a child, but to offer a pact between equals. Elara took it, her small hand disappearing into his. As they walked toward the garage, the architect of silence and the 12-year-old girl, the men in the hallway stood aside. They realized they weren't just watching a rescue mission. They were watching the birth of a legend. The air near the industrial canal tasted of salt and stagnant oil. Matteo's strike team moved like a single, multi-headed shadow, their footsteps swallowed by the rhythmic churning of the nearby power plant. Elara led them to a rusted iron grate choked with decades of city refuse. It looked impassable, a jagged mouth of twisted metal, but she pointed to a loose hinge and a narrow gap beneath the silt. The basement is 10 yards in, she whispered, her eyes reflecting the cold moonlight. Stay low. The floorboards above are thin. Matteo signaled his men. They slid into the dark, wet belly of the plant, moving with a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the world above. As they emerged into the sub-basement, the sounds of the vultures drifted down through the vents. It was a chaotic symphony of barking laughter, the clink of cheap glass, and the heavy thud of a rhythmic bass from a portable radio. These were men who thrived on the noise of their own cruelty, unaware that the silence of the Caruso family was already closing in around them. Matteo reached the top of the cellar stairs first. He didn't burst through the door with a shout. He stepped into the main packing floor with a chilling, predatory calm. The vultures, a dozen men in leather jackets and stained flannels, were scattered around a makeshift card table. When they saw the silhouette of the dawn, the laughter died instantly. Who the one started, reaching for a shotgun leaning against a crate. A single, suppressed pop from Luca's sidearm took the weapon out of the man's hand before he could even wrap his fingers around the trigger. Matteo didn't hide behind a pillar. He walked into the center of the room, his dark suit a sharp, elegant contrast to the filth of the warehouse. He looked at the vultures not as enemies, but as a mess that needed to be cleaned. You have something that belongs to a friend of mine, Matteo said. His voice was low, carrying through the cavernous space without effort. It was the sound of a man who had already decided how the night would end. The vultures scrambled in a panicked frenzy, tipping chairs and shouting over one another, their movements erratic and desperate. They fired wildly, their bullets thudding harmlessly into heavy wooden pallets. In response, Matteo's team operated with surgical precision. They didn't spray lead, they picked targets. Each movement was calculated, each shot a period at the end of a sentence. Through the smoke and the screams of the folding gang, Matteo's eyes stayed fixed on a reinforced steel door at the far end of the floor. He could hear a small, muffled cry from behind it. The chaos of the vultures was being dismantled piece by piece, but Matteo wasn't looking at the fallen. He was looking for the boy. The steel door didn't require a battering ram. Matteo simply stepped aside as Luca blew the hinges with a controlled charge. The door groaned and fell inward, revealing a cramped, windowless office that smelled of stale cigarettes and fear. In the corner, huddled on a crate, was Toby. He looked smaller than in the Polaroid, his eyes wide and vacant, mirroring the same haunted expression Matteo had seen in his brother Nico decades ago. Standing over him was Vulture Ray, a man whose reputation was built on the misery of those who couldn't fight back. He held a jagged hunting knife far too close to the boy's throat, his hands slick with sweat. Ray wasn't a soldier, he was a scavenger who had suddenly realized he was trapped in a room with a lion. Back off, Caruso. Ray shrieked, his voice cracking as he retreated into the corner, pulling Toby with him. I know how this works. You kill me, the kid dies. You leave, and maybe I let him go at the docks. That's the trade. Mateo walked into the room, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the concrete. He didn't raise his weapon. He didn't even look at the knife. He stopped 6 feet away, his silhouette casting a long, dark shadow that swallowed the smaller man. You think this is a negotiation, Ray? Mateo asked, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the office. You think we are trading cards at a table? Ray's blade trembled against Toby's skin. I'm serious. One move and I. Look at me, Mateo commanded. The sheer authority in his tone forced Ray's eyes upward. You sent a 12-year-old girl to my house with a silver pistol. You used a child's love to try and do what you were too cowardly to do yourself. In my world, that isn't business. That is a sin. Mateo took a slow, deliberate step forward. He wasn't rushing, he was inevitable. Here is the only trade you will get tonight. You let go of the boy, and you walk out of that door. You leave this city, you leave your business, and you never look back. You become a ghost, and I forget your name. Ray let out a frantic, jagged laugh. And if I don't? Mateo's eyes turned into chips of black ice. Then I stop being the man who negotiates. I become the memory of what happens to people who hurt children. I will dismantle everything you've ever touched until there is nothing left of you but a cautionary tale told in the gutters. The silence was absolute. Ray looked at the door, then at the cold, unyielding face of the dawn. He saw no mercy there, only a window of time that was rapidly closing. With a strangled sob of pure terror, Ray shoved Toby toward Mateo and bolted for the back exit. He didn't look back. He ran as if the shadows themselves were reaching for his throat. Mateo didn't chase him. He didn't have to. He caught Toby before the boy hit the floor, pulling him into the protective folds of his dark wool coat. It's over, little one, Mateo whispered, his hand resting gently on the boy's head. Your sister is waiting. The walk out of the slaughterhouse was silent, a somber procession through the wreckage of a fallen kingdom. Mateo carried Toby as if the boy were made of glass, his heavy coat shielded the child from the sight of the broken men littering the packing floor. Outside, the rain had turned into a cold, cleansing mist. Elara was waiting by the black sedan, her small frame vibrating with a tension that threatened to snap her in two. The moment she saw the flash of Toby's pale face against Mateo's dark shoulder, a sound escaped her. A jagged, guttural sob that collapsed all the stubborn courage she had worn like armor. Mateo set the boy down, and the two siblings collided, a tangle of thin arms and desperate tears. For the first time that night, Elara looked like a 12-year-old girl again. Mateo stood back, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching the reunion with an expression that was unreadable to his men, but clear to anyone who knew the ghost of Nico. He waited until the sobbing subsided into rhythmic breathing before he turned to Luca. The vultures are done, Mateo said, his voice carrying a new, chilling resonance that seemed to travel through the very concrete of the city. But the message hasn't reached the others yet. He pulled out his phone and made a single call to the heads of the 5 major families, the men who sat in high-rises and orchestrated the city's sins. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask for permission. Tonight, a child was sent to my door with a silver pistol, Mateo said, his eyes fixed on the siblings. The men who did it are gone. But listen carefully, from this hour, the streets under the Caruso name are a sanctuary. If you use a child as a shield, a weapon, or a bargaining chip, I will not come for your business. I will not come for your territory. I will come for you. I will dismantle your world brick by brick until even your shadow is afraid to follow you. This is the only warning the architect will ever give. He ended the call and looked at the city skyline. The lights seemed to flicker, a silent acknowledgement from the underworld that a new law had been written in blood. The architect of silence had spoken, and for the first time in 30 years, the silence felt like peace. He turned back to the car, where Alara was watching him with wide, solemn eyes. She didn't see the Mafia boss anymore, she saw the man who had remembered. "Get them to the safe house," Matteo commanded, opening the door for them himself. "The one with the garden. And Luca? Make sure there's enough milk and pasta for a lifetime." As the car pulled away, Matteo stood alone in the rain, a mountain of a man who had finally found a weight he was proud to carry. The death debt was paid, but a new brotherhood had begun. The industrial smog of the city felt a world away from the quiet, tree-lined suburb where the Caruso family maintained its most private sanctuary. Here, the air tasted of salt spray from the nearby lake and the sweet, heavy scent of blooming jasmine. It was a place where shadows didn't hide gunmen, but offered shade to those who had forgotten what it felt like to be safe. 6 months had passed since the night of the silver pistol. Elena and Toby Quinn now lived in a small, sun-drenched cottage on the edge of the estate. The death debt was a ghost, exorcised by the systematic dismantling of the vultures, whose names had been scrubbed from the city's ledger as if they had never existed. Alara stood in the center of a small vegetable garden, her movements confident and rhythmic as she showed Toby how to prune the tomato vines. Her eyes were no longer hollow. The tired look that had aged her prematurely had been replaced by a bright, sharp intelligence. She wore a dress that fit her, and her hair was pulled back in a neat braid. She looked like a girl who had finally been allowed to stop running. A few hundred yards away, parked on a low rise overlooking the cottage, sat a black sedan. Matteo Caruso sat in the back seat, his window rolled down just enough to let in the afternoon breeze. He didn't have his phone out. He wasn't reviewing ledgers or planning hits. He was simply watching. "They're doing well, boss," Luca said from the driver's seat, his voice unusually soft. "The girl is top of her class in the private academy." The boy, he started laughing again. "One of the gardeners said he spent an hour chasing a butterfly yesterday." Matteo nodded slowly. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, framed object. It wasn't a ledger or a weapon. It was the original crayon drawing Sophie had given him, a reminder of a different child, a different debt, and a different life. But next to it lay a new piece of paper, a thank you note from Alara, written in precise, elegant script, detailing Toby's first day of school. In the underworld, Matteo was still the architect of silence, a man whose name commanded a terrifying respect. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, he was something else. He was a silent patron, a guardian who had finally found a way to honor the memory of his brother Nico by ensuring that 2 other children would never have to know the darkness he had survived. He watched as Alara caught Toby in a game of tag, their laughter drifting up the hill like a melody. For the first time in 30 years, the cold, iron weight in Matteo's chest felt light. He had spent a lifetime building walls to keep the world out, but he had discovered that the only way to find peace was to build a sanctuary for someone else. "Drive," Matteo commanded quietly. As the car pulled away, Alara paused in the garden, looking up toward the ridge. She didn't see the car, but she felt the presence, the silent, steady shadow that had stood between her and the abyss. She smiled, a secret, knowing expression, and went back to her brother. The monster was gone, and in his place, a protector remained.